5-year-old Emily Carter was the only witness to an attempted kidnapping that took place late one afternoon. However, the traumatic event had left her deeply shaken, rendering her unable to speak about what she had seen. Every time someone asked her about that day, she would lower her head, gripping the hem of her dress tightly, her small body trembling. Her wide eyes, usually filled with curiosity, now held only fear. The only one who truly understood Emily was Rex, her loyal therapy dog. Whenever she felt anxious or overwhelmed, Rex would press his warm body against her, nudging her hand gently to reassure her. At times, when the fear became unbearable, she would clutch his fur, burying her face in his soft coat as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. Rex, in turn, would respond with soft whimpers or a protective stance, signaling her distress to those around her. As the day of the trial arrived, Emily clung to Rex, her tiny fingers gripping his collar as if he were the only safe thing in the world. The courtroom, filled with unfamiliar faces and stern voices, made her heart race. But with Rex beside her, she took hesitant steps forward. The judge and lawyers spoke gently, careful not to startle her. Whenever she hesitated, Rex would give a reassuring nudge, as if telling her she wasn't alone. Though she could not find the words to describe what had happened, her bond with Rex became a bridge to the truth. Every time she tensed at the sight of the accused or shrank back in fear, it was as if her body spoke for her. And Rex, ever vigilant, ensured that her unspoken testimony would not go unheard. The courtroom was heavy with tension, the air thick with anticipation. All eyes were on Richard Hale, the accused, who sat motionless at the defendant's table. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden surface, a slow, deliberate rhythm that betrayed no emotion. His sharp, calculating eyes swept across the room, but his face remained a mask of indifference. He had been in courtrooms before, this was not unfamiliar territory. Yet, something about this trial felt different. Across from him, perched on the large wooden witness chair, was 5-year-old Emily Carter. The little girl, dwarfed by the imposing seat, sat clutching her therapy dog, Rex, a golden retriever trained to comfort children in distress. Her small fingers tangled in his thick fur, gripping tightly as though the dog was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her wide eyes darted nervously around the room, flinching at every movement, every sound. Her parents sat just a few feet away, their hands clasped together in silent prayer. They had witnessed her struggles, the nightmares that jolted her awake, the way she recoiled from shadows, the way she had stopped speaking about that night altogether. Now, they could only watch and hope. The prosecutor, a woman with a soft yet commanding presence, stepped forward cautiously, careful not to startle the fragile witness. She knelt slightly, lowering herself to Emily's level, her voice gentle but steady. "Emily, sweetheart," she said, her tone warm and patient. "Can you tell us about that night? Do you remember what happened?" Emily's breath hitched. Her little chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths. Her fingers tightened around Rex's fur as if drawing strength from him. She didn't look at Richard Hale. She couldn't. His presence felt like a dark cloud looming over her, heavy and suffocating. She swallowed hard, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. A flicker of movement from the defense table caught her attention. Richard Hale had shifted slightly, leaning back, his mouth curled into the faintest hint of a smirk. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emily saw it. Her body tensed instantly, her small shoulders drawing up as if to make herself smaller. Rex, ever watchful, sensed her distress. He leaned into her, pressing his warm body against hers, his tail no longer wagging. The comforting weight of his presence seemed to steady her. Slowly, with a shaky breath, Emily lifted her arm. The room seemed to hold its breath. Her tiny hand, trembling but determined, extended outward, her finger pointing directly at Richard Hale. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor straightened, exchanging a knowing glance with the judge. On the other side of the room, the defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening around his pen. Richard Hale's smirk vanished. His fingers, which had been tapping so rhythmically before, now stilled. His jaw tensed, and for the first time, his carefully constructed mask seemed to crack. Rex let out a low, guttural growl, his golden eyes locked onto the accused. It wasn't aggressive, just enough to send a message. The judge raised an eyebrow at the reaction. The prosecutor spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Emily, do you feel safe now?" The little girl hesitated, her small hand retreating as she curled into Rex's protective warmth. Then, ever so slightly, she shook her head. A silence heavier than any words filled the room. Emily hadn't spoken a single sentence. She hadn't needed to. Her trembling hand, her unspoken fear, the quiet understanding between her and Rex, it was all the testimony the court needed. The courtroom was tense, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. All eyes were on the small girl sitting in the witness stand, Emily Carter. Her tiny hands clutched tightly at the soft fur of Rex, her therapy dog, as though he were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her wide, uncertain eyes darted around the room, reflecting fear and hesitation. Across from her sat Richard Hale, the accused, his expression unreadable, his demeanor eerily calm. The prosecutor took a step closer, her voice steady but gentle. "Emily, can you tell us what happened that night?" Silence. A suffocating stillness fell over the room. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Emily's fingers trembled slightly against Rex's fur. The golden retriever, sensing her distress, pressed closer, his warm body a silent reassurance. Then, a flicker of movement, so small, so subtle, but noticeable to those who were watching closely. Emily flinched at the mention of the bad man. Her breath hitched, her shoulders tensed. She did not speak, but her body spoke for her. The prosecutor, ever patient, changed her approach. "Emily, do you remember what he looked like?" Still, no words. But then, slowly, Emily reached for a piece of paper and a pencil. Her hand was unsteady, the first lines hesitant and shaky. But as she continued, the strokes became firmer, more deliberate. The outline of a tall man emerged on the page, his face shadowed, a scar running along his neck. The tension in the courtroom escalated. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others turned their attention to Richard Hale. For the first time since the trial began, his expression shifted, his fingers curled into fists, his jaw tightened. A low growl rumbled from Rex. The prosecutor turned, holding up the drawing for all to see. Her voice, now sharpened with certainty, cut through the heavy silence. "Richard Hale, I believe she has recognized you." Emily never uttered a word. But the way her body recoiled, the way her hands gripped at Rex, the unspoken terror in her eyes, all of it spoke volumes. In that moment, the weight of truth settled over the room. Emily had given them the answer they needed, not with words, but with a signal louder than any testimony. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, pressing down on everyone like an invisible weight. Every sound, the rustle of papers, the shifting of chairs, felt amplified in the heavy silence. At the center of it all sat Emily Carter, a fragile, pale-faced girl barely holding herself together in the witness stand. Her small hands trembled slightly as she clutched the fur of her golden retriever, Rex, her lifeline in this unfamiliar and terrifying place. Rex lay at her feet, his golden coat gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights. Usually, he was calm, a steady presence trained to provide comfort and support. But today, something was different. His ears were perked, his muscles taut beneath Emily's grip. From the moment Richard Hale entered the courtroom, Rex had been on edge. He didn't bark, he was too well trained for that, but the low, almost inaudible growl that rumbled deep in his chest sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. The prosecutor, sensing her hesitation, softened his voice. "Emily, can you tell us what you remember?" The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Emily lowered her gaze, staring at the polished wood of the witness stand. Her fingers curled tighter into Rex's fur. The images in her mind were sharp, vivid, the coldness of that night, the overwhelming fear, the shadow that loomed over her. She wanted to speak, wanted to force the words out, but her throat tightened, trapping the memories inside. Then, Rex moved. It was subtle at first, a small shift, his body pressing protectively against Emily's legs. His tail, usually relaxed, was rigid, his gaze locked onto Richard Hale. When the defendant shifted slightly in his seat, Rex's growl grew louder, more distinct. The sound was low, but in the tense courtroom, it might as well have been a gunshot. A ripple of whispers spread through the spectators. The judge's eyes flickered toward the dog, then back at Emily. Even the defense attorney hesitated, his pen pausing mid-motion. Emily flinched, her breath coming quicker now. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She knew what Rex was telling her. He recognized the danger. He sensed what she was too afraid to say out loud. She clenched her fists. The weight of silence was unbearable. Finally, she forced herself to look up, straight at Richard Hale. Her lips parted, and for the first time since that terrible night, she spoke. It was him. A hush fell over the room. Rex let out one final growl before settling beside her, his duty fulfilled. The courtroom was charged with a palpable tension, each person on edge, waiting for the moment when the prosecution would present its most important piece of evidence. The air felt heavy, as though even the smallest shift in the room would shatter the uneasy stillness that had settled over everyone. Emily sat at the witness stand, her palms pressed tightly against the wood, the slight tremor in her fingers betraying the calm she was trying so desperately to maintain. Her heart raced in her chest, but she focused on breathing, in and out, willing herself to stay composed. She had prepared for this moment, going over everything in her mind 1,000 times, ensuring she knew exactly what to say, but now that it was finally here, she couldn't escape the weight of the moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, so close yet so distant, was slipping through her fingers. The prosecutor stood up, his voice steady but carrying a note of urgency. He moved toward the evidence table and reached for an envelope that had been placed under heavy guard. It was small, unremarkable at first glance, but Emily knew it contained the one thing that could change everything. The one thing she had feared and hoped for in equal measure. As he opened the envelope, a quiet murmur spread through the room, everyone bracing for what would come next. He pulled out a single photograph and laid it flat on the table. Emily's breath caught in her throat the instant she saw it. It wasn't a clear image, blurry, pixelated, taken from a security camera, but the figure in the photo was unmistakable. A dark shadow stood near the doorway of her father's office, the faint outline of a person barely visible. But the object in their hand, the silver keychain, was as clear as day. It was the keychain she had seen her father wear every day for as long as she could remember, the one he had kept on his desk in a place of honor. The one he had never taken off. The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze around Emily as the photograph was passed around, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The room felt distant, as though she were seeing everything through a fog. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out the murmurs from the audience, the whispers from the defense. She could feel the blood rush to her head as a cold sweat broke out along her neck. The figure in the photo was holding the keychain. There was no mistaking it. The truth she had feared was staring her in the face. Her gaze snapped to the defense table, where Richard Hale, the man she had long suspected, sat motionless. His expression was unreadable, but Emily could see the faintest flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Her stomach churned as she realized this photo, this single, damning image, was the key to everything. The key to unraveling the web of lies that had surrounded her father's death. "Your Honor," the defense attorney interjected, his voice sharp and quick, trying to regain control of the situation. "This image is inconclusive. It could be anyone. It doesn't prove anything." But Emily could hardly focus on the lawyer's words. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, growing louder with each passing second. The weight of the moment, of the truth she had feared for so long, pressed down on her chest. She felt as though she were suffocating, trapped in the realization that the person who had taken her father's life had been so close to her all along. Her mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic blur. She wanted to stand up, to shout, to tell everyone in the room what she knew, to make them understand the significance of the photograph. But she stayed seated, gripped by a mixture of disbelief and fear. The evidence was right there, so clear, so irrefutable. And yet, a part of her still couldn't believe it. She didn't want to believe it. But as the prosecutor made his way back to the stand, turning the photo so the jury could see it clearly, Emily finally felt something shift inside her. The truth, no matter how painful, was undeniable now. Richard Hale had been there. He had been in that office. The keychain was proof, the final piece in a puzzle she had spent years trying to solve. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if trying to ground herself in the reality of it all. The weight that had been pressing on her for so long, the uncertainty, the fear, the anger, all of it flooded her in that single instant. And when she opened her eyes again, she knew there was no turning back. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same. The courtroom buzzed with an almost palpable tension, the kind that weighed heavily on every person in the room. The trial had reached its critical moment, and all eyes were fixed on Richard Hale, the defense attorney. He had been the picture of unwavering confidence, his every word delivered with precise calculation. Throughout the trial, he had maintained an air of control, seemingly always 3 steps ahead, dismantling the prosecution's arguments with a cool efficiency that left little room for doubt. But now, as the weight of the case bore down on him, the slightest crack began to form in his poised exterior. The prosecutor, sensing an opening, stood up once more, his movements deliberate and sharp. He adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on Hale, who sat motionless, his posture straight, though there was an unmistakable tightness in his shoulders that suggested the stress was starting to creep in. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence, calm but edged with an underlying intensity. Mr. Hale, you have made several claims throughout this trial about the unreliability of the evidence against your client. However, I believe you have missed something that could unravel the entire foundation of your defense. His words echoed through the room, sending a ripple of anticipation through the spectators. Everyone was waiting for Hale's response. Hale's fingers twitched slightly, the only sign that he felt the pressure mounting. His eyes flickered briefly to the large photograph of the keychain displayed on the screen, and his chest tightened at the sight of it. Emily, still seated at the witness stand, couldn't help but notice the brief flash of uncertainty in his eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual calm facade, but she had seen it. Hale's control, so carefully maintained, was beginning to slip. The prosecutor's voice was steady, though it carried a sharpness that cut through the air. I'm referring to the timeline, Mr. Hale. Specifically, the moment when your client was allegedly miles away from the scene of the crime. According to the alibi your team has presented, your client should have been nowhere near the location. Yet this photograph, he gestured toward the image of the keychain, places him directly at the scene, and the timestamp on the security footage doesn't lie. It completely contradicts your entire defense. A hushed silence fell over the courtroom. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Hale. His jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment, his expression flickered. It was so brief, yet unmistakable, a glimmer of panic that he tried desperately to suppress. His carefully crafted mask of confidence faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the edges of the desk with a white-knuckled intensity. I don't know what you mean, Hale stammered, his voice losing some of its usual assurance. That photograph is irrelevant. It could have been taken at any time. The timestamp is inconclusive. But Emily could see it, she could see the crack in his armor. His response lacked the usual sharpness, and the slightest tremor in his voice betrayed him. He was trying to regain control, but the doubt had already seeped in. His earlier arrogance seemed distant now, replaced by a quiet but palpable unease. Emily felt a wave of vindication, but she remained focused. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when everything Hale had carefully built would start to unravel. The prosecutor didn't relent, his voice cutting through the silence with precision. But the keychain, Mr. Hale, the one your client has been wearing in numerous public appearances, the one we've established as a personal item of his. Why is it that this same keychain appears in the photo you're dismissing? Why is it in the location that places him at the scene, at the precise time of the incident? Hale's eyes darted to the screen again, his gaze narrowing in an attempt to deflect. He straightened up in his chair, attempting to reassert his composure, but the damage was already done. He had been caught in his own web of contradictions. His own defense, which had seemed so impenetrable only moments ago, was now riddled with holes. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He was no longer the master of the courtroom, as he had once been. The room felt like it was closing in on him. Hale's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the walls were closing in, and every attempt to salvage the situation only made it worse. He had misjudged the strength of the evidence, underestimated the significance of the photo, and now his earlier calmness was betraying him. His fingers began to tap nervously on the table, a subtle but telling sign of his mounting frustration. The prosecutor pressed on. "It's not just the photograph, Mr. Hale. It's the security footage, the timestamps, the witnesses who've testified. Everything you've claimed about your client's alibi is now in question. What do you have to say about that?" Hale opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and his face flushed with the unmistakable color of panic. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand briefly running through his hair, a rare crack in his usually composed exterior. Emily watched him closely, her heart hammering in her chest. She had been waiting for this. She had known this moment would come, when the carefully crafted narrative Hale had so confidently spun would fall apart. And now, as she watched him struggle, the sense of vindication was almost overwhelming. She had been right all along. Hale's slip-up, his failure to cover his tracks completely, had exposed him. There was no way he could talk his way out of this. As the seconds stretched into an eternity, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Richard Hale, the once unshakable defense attorney, was now a man visibly unraveling. His earlier certainty had crumbled, and with it, his entire defense. His mind, which had so expertly navigated the twists and turns of the trial, was now scrambling, looking for a way to salvage what little remained of his credibility. Emily could feel the shift in the room. The murmur of realization spread like wildfire. The defense, once so polished, was now in tatters. Hale was losing control, and the case, no, the truth, was slipping away from him. The keychain, the photo, the timeline, everything that had seemed like a loose thread was now a glaring contradiction that Hale couldn't deny. The web he had carefully woven was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A bead of sweat appeared on Hale's forehead, his face pale. He continued to stammer, grasping at straws, but every word seemed to sink him further into a pit of uncertainty. His earlier bravado had turned to desperation. His defense was crumbling, and he knew it. The more he tried to dig himself out, the deeper he sank. For Emily, the realization that the truth was finally coming to light was almost surreal. The moment she had waited for, the moment when Richard Hale's carefully built facade would collapse, had arrived. As the courtroom watched in stunned silence, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. The truth was undeniable, and Hale's slip-up had exposed it for all to see. There was no more room for doubt. The courtroom, once filled with the murmurs of spectators and the rustling of papers, was now eerily silent. Every individual present seemed to hold their breath as the tension in the air thickened with each passing second. For weeks, the trial had unfolded with meticulous precision, the prosecution and defense locked in a battle of wits. Emily Harper, the determined prosecutor, had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, knowing that the key to securing justice lay just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. But what happened in the following moments, no one could have predicted. Richard Hale, the defense attorney, had been the calm, composed figure of the trial. His arguments were sharp, his demeanor unshaken, and his focus unwavering. But now, something was different. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in his posture, the barely audible sound of his fingers drumming on the table. A deep breath. The kind of breath one takes when the weight of something heavy presses down upon them. Hale stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The suddenness of his movement startled everyone in the room, but what struck them more was the tension in his body. His shoulders were stiff, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. There was a flicker in his eyes, a brief moment of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Emily watched him closely, her own heart beating faster with the realization that something was happening, something she hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Hale, do you have something to say?" The judge's voice was stern, but even he seemed slightly taken aback by the unexpected action. The entire room, including Emily, was now focused entirely on Hale. His words could change everything. Hale's voice faltered at first, as if the words he had been holding inside for so long were struggling to escape. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a rawness, a cracking that seemed to echo throughout the courtroom. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. The silence that followed felt suffocating, the anticipation thick enough to cut through with a knife. I can't do this anymore," Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand trembled slightly as it gripped the edge of the defense table, the white knuckles standing out against the pale skin. Emily's mind raced as she processed his words. What was he saying? What did he mean by "can't do this anymore"? She could see the strain in his face, the tightness around his eyes, the subtle tremor in his lips. For a moment, it seemed as though he was fighting with himself, as if something inside him was at war. The judge's brow furrowed in confusion. "Mr. Hale, if you have something to say, please do so clearly." Hale took another deep breath, his entire body tense as if preparing for an impact. It was as though he had been holding on to something for far too long, and now, in this single moment, the weight of his own actions was finally overwhelming him. He looked down at the floor, then back up at the judge, and then slowly, he turned to face the courtroom. I confess," Hale said, the words hanging in the air, thick with their implications. His voice broke slightly as he said it, but there was a palpable sense of finality in his tone. It was not an admission of guilt alone, it was something deeper. A moment of truth, long buried, now surfacing with the force of a tidal wave. The room was stunned into silence. Emily's mind went blank. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted, the floor giving way beneath her as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her eyes locked onto Hale's face. His expression was one of anguish, but not the kind of anguish she had seen in a defendant cornered by the law. No, this was something else. This was the torment of a man who had been carrying the burden of his actions in secret, who had lived with the knowledge of his role in the crime but had never allowed himself to speak it. Until now. I confess to being complicit in the crime, Hale continued, his voice now growing steadier, but with a weight behind it that made it clear this was no last-minute strategy. This was the confession of someone who had come to the end of their own internal struggle. I helped him, my client. I helped him cover up the truth. I manipulated the evidence. I built a case based on lies. And I knew what I was doing. I knew it was wrong. But I allowed my ambition, my desire to win, to cloud my judgment. And now, I can't live with it anymore. Each word felt like a weight lifted from his chest, but it was clear from his face that this release didn't bring him relief, it brought him a deeper pain. He had crossed a line, and now, the consequences of his actions were crashing down around him. Emily could barely process the enormity of what he was saying. Her mind was reeling. Had he really just admitted to being part of the conspiracy? Had this entire trial been based on a foundation of lies? She felt a flicker of disbelief. This couldn't be real, could it? She had spent so long trying to uncover the truth, but now the truth was being handed to her in the most unexpected way. Hale's voice faltered again, his confession coming in broken pieces, each one more difficult than the last. I thought I could get away with it. I thought I could protect him and keep my career intact. But the lies became too much. And now I can't escape them. I'm guilty. I am guilty of everything. Emily felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. There was a sense of vindication, yes, the truth had finally come to light, but there was also a deep sadness. She had respected Hale, had admired his skill in the courtroom. And now, seeing him break down, seeing him admit to his crimes in such a public way, it was a reminder that no one was truly above the law. Not even someone who had once seemed untouchable. The defendant, sitting beside Hale, looked stunned, frozen in place as his lawyer's confession unfolded. Emily noticed his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking nervously between Hale and the courtroom. He must have realized that his fate was now sealed. No more lies, no more tricks. It was all over. The judge, still in shock, finally spoke. "Mr. Hale, are you telling this court that you aided in this crime?" "Yes, Your Honor," Hale said, his voice now firm, though the weight of his words was still evident in the tremor of his hands. "I helped him. I helped him cover it up. I lied to the court. And for that, I am sorry." The room was still. No one knew what to say or do. Emily looked at Hale, and for the first time in the entire trial, she saw him as something more than an adversary. She saw a man, broken and exposed, unable to hide from the consequences of his choices. I have to ask for the court's mercy," Hale continued, his voice breaking as he faced the judge again. "I know what I've done, but I cannot undo it. All I can do now is face the consequences." Emily's heart was pounding, but she held herself steady. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and calm despite the chaos of emotions swirling within her, "I believe we can now proceed with the truth. The confession we have all been waiting for has finally come to light. The truth cannot be ignored." The judge, though visibly shaken by the sudden turn of events, nodded slowly. "We will recess for now, and reconvene later to determine the appropriate course of action. The gravity of this confession cannot be underestimated." As the gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Emily felt the weight of the moment. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. The case, which had seemed so uncertain and tangled, had now found its clarity. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, Emily felt that justice was within her reach.